Sonja is the director of the Biopolitics of Science Research Network, research leader of the Biohumanity theme, and she is a member of the Sydney Southeast Asia Center, the Charles Perkins Center, and the Sydney Asia Pacific Migration Center. She is co-editor of the Palgrave Macmillan Biolegalities book series, book review co-editor for Catalyst, and on the editorial board of the Sociological Review. She's received numerous awards, including the Sydney Research Accelerator Prize, the University of Sydney Discovery Early Career Researcher Award, Australian Research Council Biomedicine and Legal Governance and Globalization, the Nancy L. Book Postdoctoral Fellowship at Brown University, and the Rubicon Early Career Researcher Award from the Netherlands Organization for Scientific Research. Her general research interests include sociology of globalization, science and technology studies, feminist and post-colonial theory, legal anthropology, global health, and social medicine. We're so pleased that Sonja is at IAS this year. She would have been here last year, but I think there was a bit of a delay. Thus, when I told you she was the 2020-21 Founders Circle member, that is actually the case. That was, but it's a holdover, and we're glad you're here this fall. She is here along with her husband, who is a visitor and with us today, and their family. We're so pleased as well to have friends Debbie Lunder and Alan Zekowitz with us, who have provided generous support for Sonja's membership as Founder Circle donors. Thank you, Debbie and Alan. So please now join me in welcoming Sonja van Wichelen, who will speak with us today on governing bioscience in globalization. There will be time for questions after the talk.
Ooh, it's nice to have that mask off. Thank you, Pamela, for your introduction and your keen organization of this event, one that is in person for the first time again after such a long time. And it feels so good to give a talk in front of people, to see their faces and not to have this black computer screen in front of me. And let me take this opportunity to thank the Friends of the Institute, but in particular, Deborah Lunder and Alan Ezekowitz, who have generously funded my membership with the IAS. I'm honored to be the 2020-2021 Founders Circle member in the School of Social Science, and grateful to have this opportunity to share my work with you. Now, as a child from a working class Indonesian mother, for whom money played a decisive role in carving out her life, and a Jesuit turned to humanitarian worker father from Belgium, whose virtue was to care less about money, I have long been intrigued with how money and markets intervene in our intimate and moral lives. While our norms and values in Western society divide morals from markets and the sacred from the profane, we endlessly witness, as the Princeton sociologist Viviana Zelizer so eloquently demonstrates, their intermingling in our lives. Now, my work so far has studied this intermingling with a focus on institutions. How do institutions, states, organizations, or corporations navigate this intermingling of economy and intimacy, of markets and morals? So my recent book, which is called Legitimating Life, Adoption in the Age of Globalization and Biotechnology. This book, for instance, focused on the practice of international child adoption, while insisting on the normative premise that the care of children in need is noble and necessary. I traced how the practice, particularly in the global space, became unavoidably entangled with reproductive markets and economic forces of supply and demand. I was fascinated with how regulatory frameworks and legal institutions became the primary sites to resolve discrepancies between morals and markets. This, I learned, had everything to do with the foundational distinction between persons and things in modern law. While we can circulate things, namely entities that can be alienated and therefore untethered from their origins, we cannot circulate persons, as they are the subject of inalienable rights and duties. Persons are those who, as the Dutch Romanist Hugo Grotius stated in the 16th century, persons have rights to things. Now, my current interest turns to one of the biggest contemporary challenges to this social and legal distinction between persons and things: the development of life sciences in the last century, particularly bioscience, biomedicine, and biotechnology. It is here that we find the distinction troubled and weakened. We can see this development clearly by looking at the circulation of human biological matter for research and medicine, the focus of my current research, which can include body parts, organs, blood, tissue, reproductive matter, cell lines, viruses, bacteria. While human biological materials have long been circulated for biomedicine, the technologies we have developed in the meantime can create new potentialities and turn these materials into valuable and commodifiable research tools, diagnostics, and therapeutics. We can now freeze human eggs, also called oocytes, for instance, using cryogenic technologies, extending fertility and reproduction to a much later point in time. Here, the value of eggs changes according to the potentiality and knowledge bestowed upon the matter. This has enormous implications for ethical and legal debates, especially governing the transfer of these oocytes for research, but also for family and inheritance law regulating the property rights over human oocytes. More importantly, these technologies also change the course of biological reproduction itself. If I freeze my eggs, my grandchildren will be able to use my eggs for reproduction even long after my death. While this sounds like a theoretical proposition, the practice is actually becoming more common. Now, important in these developments is the growing public notion that often human biological materials remain attached to the originating body. Sometimes this entails a repersonification of matter to make this attachment visible again. So let me illustrate this with another example. I believe you all know the story about the HeLa cells, which involved the cells of an African-American woman, Henrietta Lacks from Baltimore, who suffered from a rare form of cervical cancer and died in 1951. Researchers at Johns Hopkins found that her cells multiplied aggressively, and from a sample they removed from her, without her consent, they were able to make the first immortal cell line. These HeLa cells, as they were named, were commercialized, used in medical research labs across the world, and yielded enormous income, which stood in stark contrast to the impoverished life of Lacks herself. Now, the historian of science, Hannah Lendecker, demonstrates how the HeLa cells were always tethered to the person of Henrietta Lacks throughout history. Gender, race, class played a huge role in shaping this personification process. But it was not until recently that public controversy erupted around consent and privacy rights. The controversy, driven by the publication of a best-selling book on Lacks' life by the science writer Rebecca Skloot, led the NIH in 2013 to give Lacks' family control over access to the sequence data of the HeLa cell lines. But other more structural explanations explain why the controversy emerged in the 2010s, 50 years after the death of Henrietta Lacks. The emergence and consolidation of patents in the 1980s changed the way researchers shared their biological material. While it allowed for the commodification of human biological material, the patenting system also brought about new legal thinking around property and ownership. The controversy should be set against this background, where publics engage not only with emerging bioscience, but also with the legal developments facilitating them. A sociology of biolegality can provide us with a deeper understanding of its meanings and stakes. Now, in my talk today, I discuss similar developments, but I take the debate to a global scale by asking the question how transnational governance systems and regulatory frameworks are shaping global bioscientific exchange in the 21st century. Attending to our pandemic condition, I zoom in on the global circulation of virus samples and place it in the context of global health. Indonesia will figure as my empirical site, though my argument extends to other countries in the global south. Let me start briefly by historicizing scientific exchange, biomedical ones in particular, and doing absolutely no justice to historians, and I'm looking at the historian in the room here, but functioning more as a necessity to contextualize my story about global science. So ever since the beginning of modern science in Europe, exchange and collaboration was key to the progress of scientific inquiry. Before the advent of patents, local and global circulation of materials took place amongst scientists themselves and happened via scholarly friendships and trust networks. This does not mean, however, that they were entirely self-governing. The state and commerce were often implicated in some way. So the historian of science, Mario Biagioli, for instance, describes how in the early modern Italian state, the gift exchange between scientists revealed a patronage system dependent on a cycle of debt between client and patron. While the ideology of the scientific commons was strong among scientists, the actual practice of circulation and exchange revealed complex moral economies informed by social, economic, and cultural status. One can say that throughout time, science has always been indebted to its benefactor, whether this sponsor is the state or the market. These moral economies become more complicated when exchange took place between European states and their colonies. Scientific collaboration between the European metropole and its colonies formed the basis for colonial and tropical medicine. The colony was an important space for biomedical research, not only to better the health of colonizers and their military, but also because lack of ethical oversight rendered colonial subjects more readily available as experimental subjects. These conditions turned the colony into what some have called a living laboratory. Studies on the circulation of human body parts and material for global science demonstrate the complexity of exchange systems amongst foreign and local scientists during colonial and post-colonial periods. So in his study of the neurological disorder Kuru and the circulations of brains for global science in and out of Papua New Guinea, historian of medicine Warwick Anderson describes how this circulation process involved the creation of value different from a conventional process of commodification. Once the material was untethered from the foray community, it became a figure of gift exchange amongst scientists. It is important then to examine how scientific exchange is entangled and shaped by relations of power and its distribution of wealth. Moreover, it becomes apparent that in these exchanges, objects were never fully untethered from their origins. Now, Anderson wonders whether the economization of science in contemporary times, with its tools of intellectual property and neoliberal policies, are changing these economies of exchange that are based on the relations scientists have among each other and with local communities in the field. Do these new forms of economization render their objects mere commodities? And has the capitalization of nature progressed to such an extent that it only privileges the market at the expense of science and its publics. Let us return to the history of the present to explore this question. Besides the increased travel of and communication among scientists, an important part of narrating the story of bioscientific exchange and globalization is the development of global governance systems. For instance, those around trade, public health, biodiversity, and human rights. Now, these systems are distinct global systems with their own history, aims, and tools, and have often worked independently from each other. However, in a profound way, they are increasingly bearing upon each other and impacting society, particularly in the global south, thereby confounding how states organize their own domestic laws around the governance of bioscience. So, amid an accelerating process of economic globalization, the 1995 WTO Agreement of Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights, it's a mouthful, also known as TRIPS, was key to facilitating trade by standardizing intellectual property rights across the world. By linking trade policy to intellectual property standards, the impact and influence of TRIPS was vast and often detrimental for developing countries. Most acutely, this was felt in public health matters, such as access to medicine and their capacity to develop scientific research and development, biotechnology in particular. So 90% of all biotech patents that are granted internationally are in the hands of countries in the North. These patents make it difficult and costly to conduct any future biomedical or bioscientific research for developing countries. This in turn, as we witness so vividly in our current pandemic condition, keeps them dependent on the North for the production and distribution of medicine and vaccines. The 2001 Doha Declaration on the TRIPS Agreement and Public Health, which allowed flexibility of TRIPS to improve access to medicine, was meant to address this problem of inequality and allowed for compulsory licensing, parallel importation, limits on data protection, and other exceptions to patentability. Issues currently being hotly debated around the COVID-19 vaccine. Moreover, beyond trade, the 1992 Convention of Biological Diversity and the 2014 Nagoya Protocol on Access and Benefit Sharing introduced forms of benefit sharing to achieve more ethical and just forms of exchange. Researchers and companies were now expected to give back to providers of biological material and genetic resources. These modes of giving back included shared benefits from commercialization and access to and transfer of technology. Yet, critical observers indicate that global governance systems protecting intellectual property rights have been too strong. Combined with domestic challenges to implement flexibilities offered by the Doha Declaration, the CBD and the Nagoya Protocol, offered by the Doha Declaration, the CBD and the Nagoya Protocol, the situation prevents any serious form of progress toward eradicating these global inequalities. Now, this is also true for Indonesia, the geographical focus of my project. So rich in genetic resources and considered by Conservation International to be one of the 17 mega diverse countries in the world, the biotechnologies developed out of Indonesia, like other countries in the global south, are primarily advanced in the north, where most of the patenting and profits go. While Indonesia ratified the CBD in '94, they are yet, like other developing countries, to see the true workings of benefit sharing. A highly controversial event concerning Indonesia and the World Health Organization that took place in 2007 addressed this unequal situation heads on. Let me briefly elaborate on this provocative event because it illustrates not only the complexity and fragmentation of global governance systems, but also the multiple and contrary uses of legal instruments to leverage power within these regulatory regimes. So in 2007, amid the avian flu epidemic, also known as the bird flu or H5N1, the Indonesian government, led by the then Indonesian health minister, Siti Supari, triggered a global health crisis by refusing to share samples of the virus at the request of the World Health Organization. Indonesia declared viral sovereignty after the country realized that samples were being transferred to pharmaceutical companies outside the WHO. These institutions were able to patent the vaccines they developed, making it unaffordable for countries like Indonesia to access them. While countries in the South supported Indonesia, the WHO, backed by countries in the North, considered this an affront to the plight of public health emergencies, and more generally, to the core principle of global health. The persistence of Indonesia over the next 5 years eventually led to the WHO Pandemic Influenza Preparedness Framework. And I like how these long words have beautiful abbreviations. So this is also called the PIP framework. The PIP framework essentially made it possible to implement access and benefit sharing, ABS, principles that are core to the Convention for Biological Diversity, but into the realm of virus sharing and global health. So this allowed pathogens, just like biodiversity material, to fall under the remit of benefit sharing. Now, the path of this novel PIP framework was anything but smooth. At the heart of the debate between Indonesia and the WHO was the so-called material transfer agreement. And the lawyers amongst us will know what it is. A legally binding contract allowing the transfer of biological material from one party to the other. While Indonesia demanded that MTAs were to be put in place to govern virus samples, the WHO refused to honor this request, and their years of negotiation revolved around this legal instrument. I'm fascinated by the power that this legal tool had in the standoff. In the Euro-American context, the MTA is a standardized tool to control the use of biological material and ultimately to control profits in the economics of research. Among entrepreneurs and scientists, however, their social effect are a point of debate. While entrepreneurs insist they facilitate exchange and scientific innovation, scientists, especially public scientists, agitate against the consolidation of MTAs in universities, arguing the instruments make negotiations too complex and expensive and succumb science to intellectual property managers, delaying and censoring findings. MTAs, they say, work against the spirit of the science commons and against genuine exchange and collaboration so valued by the scientific community. Now, with this northern context in mind, how are we to understand the use of MTAs in Indonesia and in other global South countries more generally, where its advocacy and uptake has increased significantly in the past decade, notably in South Africa, Brazil, and India? What do these developments mean for global scientific exchange and for global public health? And returning to the issues I opened with, how to translate these issues back to foundational distinctions between gift and commodity, sharing and taking, persons and things. So biolegality is the constitutive relation between biology and law in the formation of knowledge and sociality. And let me give an example to make it less obscure. So my favorite example of biolegality is genetic parenthood, an outcome of the widely embraced value of genetic knowledge, which has led to the social and legal fragmentation of parenthood. That's why you've got genetic, social, biological, it gets fragmented. A sociology of biolegality examines the infrastructure in which these knowledge practices are taking place. In pursuing a sociology of biolegality, I am reminded of how Clifford Geertz approached the interdisciplinarity question. which should not be simply an attempt to join disciplines, but, and I quote, a searching out of specific analytical issues that in however different a guise and however differently addressed, lie in the path of both disciplines. It is a hermeneutic tacking between two fields, looking first one way, then the other, in order to formulate moral, political, and intellectual issues that inform them both. The specific analytical issues in the story about Indonesia, and I would argue more broadly, is that of technology and knowledge. My explanation is that first, MTAs, the material transfer agreements, perform a different function in the context of the Global South. It has become a legal device, a technology to secure benefit sharing and to intervene in existing global governance systems that have amplified global inequality and weakened the sovereign state. In contrast to soft instruments from the human rights system, it is a device with teeth, able to force change to the status quo. Here, law is a technology that redefines itself in response to new bioscientific objects and technologies. It is not determined by science, it actively shapes it, just as science and law shapes society. Second, in the context of the Global South, MTAs allow biological materials to be tethered to the state and symbolically to the imagined community of the nation. This, quite paradoxically, negotiates global configurations of intellectual property regimes by changing the premises of control and relations. Not unlike the Henrietta Lacks case, where eventually the Gila lines became tethered to the Lacks family, the MTA invokes what is called a property relation in the anthropological sense, meaning that such arrangements via what we could call moral economies of viral knowledge demand manifold obligations with different people and with different institutions. So circling back to the notion of gift and commodity, of sharing and taking of persons and things with which I started my conversation, we can understand the advent of intellectual property regimes in the realm of global science and global health as making invisible or even diminishing these forms of property relations. Whether it is immortal Gila cell lines or H5N1 virus samples, intellectual property rights and untether material from their origins and make them ready for commercialization. Yet we also witness how states find ways of leveraging them and shape new conditions and circumstances as legal instruments are reappropriated and repurposed. So in concluding, last week, the New York Times reported how pressure is growing for pharmaceutical companies like Pfizer and Moderna to share their intellectual property and technology. Less than 10% in developing countries are fully vaccinated, and 3 million people have died since the approval of the Pfizer vaccine in December last year. As the global pandemic reveals successes, incredible successes of bioscience and biomedicine, including the development of COVID-19 vaccines, it also throws into stark relief the weaknesses of existing global governance systems to bring these successes to the benefit of countries beyond the global north. This is not a new situation, but a persisting one. Global public health, including access to medicine, cannot be disentangled from intellectual property regimes. As social scientists, it is tantamount that we study not only the history in which these regimes have taken hold, but also how these regimes are negotiated or appropriated, and what this reveals about the place and meaning of scientific exchange in society today. This requires ethnographic and interdisciplinary work, ranging from the history of science to legal and economic anthropology. It also requires a sustained focus on the Global South, not only to gauge the impact of global governance, but also to see how the South is actively shaping it. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.